Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to continue our Halloween episodes, and we're going to be looking at the Bellamy Mansion in Wilmington, North Carolina, a little bit about its history and a little bit about its alleged hauntings. And Chris, I must tell you with a little bit of shame that even though I have stood on the front porch of the Bellamy Mansion, even though I have been all around it, I have never actually been in the Bellamy Mansion, inside the Bellamy Mansion. I know people who have, and I will talk about at least one of them a little later in this episode, but the stories that come out of this mansion are interesting.
I remember I was teaching a group of students American history, and I arranged for a tour of the Bellamy Mansion. And we went and visited the Bellamy Mansion, walked inside it. And what was interesting is not just kind of the history that we're going to talk about in this podcast and episode, but that there's still some archaeological work that has been ongoing in which they're still finding some unique
Yeah.
historical artifacts that give insight into who lived there and how they lived there, and some of the things that happened with Dr. Bellamy, and kind of ultimately the fire and things of that nature. And so it's a historical wonderful historical account, but as you mentioned, it still lives on today. And Wilmington, a lot of people say is haunted. There's a lot of ghost stories about Wilmington. I know that the graveyard's not too far from there, that you've got some understanding about and visited that place. So yeah, Bellamy Mansion is right in the middle of history, but also frightfulness.
Yeah, and one thing in my research here, and again, to my shame, I should have already known this, and they have got some slave quarters there that have been sort of discovered, and they've been, I think that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the
Yep.
archaeology. And of course, some of the hauntings that they talk about are connected with those slave quarters. But the mansion itself did not, it's more of a Civil War era structure. And when we call it a mansion, I mean, if you or I were living in the Bellamy Mansion, and I encourage our listeners who are not familiar with the Bellamy Mansion to go online and look at pictures of it. It's not a mansion in the sense that you have this huge house somewhere that, just covers the landscape, like when you think of some of these large mansions. If one person was living in it, it would definitely be very large, but it's sort of a square white structure. What is it, 3 or 4 stories altogether? It's got a basement. So the word mansion may be a bit exaggerating it a little bit, but it's definitely a large house. Construction began on the Bellamy Mansion. I think it was like 1859. And didn't the family of Dr. John Bellamy move into the mansion in 1861?
Yeah, and it's not a typical plantation kind of house because it's right in the historic district of Wilmington. And you kind of walk by, it's not big. It's kind of the old antebellum square kind
Yeah.
of houses, if you will. Got a beautiful front. You were talking about the porch. Porch is
Mhm.
absolutely beautiful.
It is.
And one of the things that you understand is that it is a nice size home, but it's really not a huge home. But when Dr. Bellamy moves in 1861, we need to keep the historical moment in this, that is right there at the beginnings of the American Civil War, and Wilmington was a hotbed of activity during the Civil War. But when he moved into that house, him and his wife had been married for over 20 years, and they had 8 children, ranging from a little baby all the way up to a toddler. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that Miss Bellamy was pregnant with another child. So you've got all of that moving in. As you mentioned, you have the enslaved who are working there at the mansion, who stay kind of in the back quarters there. And then the war comes right to their doorstep, and that changes everything.
Yeah, and Dr. Bellamy, John Bellamy, um, like you said, they move in 1861, but when secession starts happening, when North Carolina secedes from the Union, he's extremely happy about this. He is a pro Confederate guy. He is a true believer in the Confederate cause. Um, so yeah, once the Civil War breaks out, it comes right to Wilmington. It comes right to, as you said, it comes right to his doorstep. But one of the things that comes right to his doorstep, Chris, is yellow fever. And that is actually the initial thing that causes him and his family to leave the mansion and to go elsewhere. Because, of course, if you remember, and I'm trying to dig back in my memory here, uh, one of the blockade runner ships arrived in Wilmington and apparently was carrying yellow fever, I guess, among mosquitoes that were on the ship. And yellow fever gets loose there in Wilmington. And of course, people with means, they don't run, but they leave town. And Bellamy and his wife and children are among those. And of course, what happens is federal troops, Union troops under General Joseph Hawley, come in and take control of the house. They take control of the property.
Well, because Fort Fisher is right there, and so when Fort Fisher is kind of taken over by the Union, it's a devastating blow to the Confederacy because Wilmington was a major port that would supply the southern states, and I mean, the Union people come in and they're pushing the Confederate troops out, they're pushing the families out, but they're also looking at where they can stay. They're tired of me. Ray, do you want to stay in tents, on the ground, or do you just occupy these really nice homes that are in Wilmington? And so they start taking over these finer homes. And as you mentioned, General Hawley is assigned to watch over the Wilmington district, and he says, "Well, I'll take this house." And not only that, but soon after, he tells his wife, "Hey, I got a nice home here. It's got all the fixings, all the workings. Why don't you come on down and stay with me while I'm fighting the war?" And she comes down, but she's also a nurse. And so she says, "Well, I'm not just going to sit here while you're doing something. I can do something." And so she begins to treat some of the wounded that have been injured in some of the battles. And some of those individuals are are being treated at the Bellamy Mansion. So you have to set up something interesting here. You have Dr. Bellamy, who is a ardent successionist, and you've got General Hawley here, who has the house, and Dr. Bellamy at the end of the war, Ray, he wants his house back.
Yep.
War's over, and he just simply goes to Bellamy and says, or excuse me, goes to Hawley and says, "Can I have my house back?" And General Hawley, well, he basically has a few things that he wants to say about that.
Yeah, it takes him a while to get his house back. He actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Dr. Bellamy had to get a pardon from Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, before he could get his house back.
And Dr. Bellamy had to take an oath of
Yeah.
allegiance. He had to swear that he was no longer going to do anything with the Confederacy and that he was going to be pro Union. And once all of that happens, he finally is able to get his house back.
Yeah, and Mrs. Bellamy is not happy when she gets home. And I think you were talking about them treating soldiers and stuff in the mansion, probably explains the condition of the mansion when they return, when the Bellamy's return home. It's apparently, just sort of not really well taken care of. A lot of the pictures and stuff, hasn't been damaged, but it's dirty. It hasn't been, cleaned very well. So she is just absolutely horrified at what she finds when she returns home. So it takes time for them to sort of, I guess, get settled back in, which, Wilmington was a site of war during the Revolution. It was a site of, we talked about a minute ago, yellow fever. So a lot of death, a lot of sickness, a lot of bad things going on in the area. So it's understandable that the house might not be in that great of shape. But the Bellamy's moved back into the house, Chris, and that's when things start taking some interesting turns. Um, because apparently some of the slaves that Bellamy had remained at the house as servants, and they continued working at the house at Bellamy Mansion. And they had a son, the Bellamy's had a son called Willie. And Willie seems to me to have been something of a troublemaker. And I think some of the rumors that this house was haunted, that's where it actually starts. It starts with Willie. Do you know anything about Willie, Chris? I mean, what an interesting guy. Uh he goes to medical school in New York, and he returns with a skeleton. Sounds like something I would come back with.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. This is kind of when the story takes the turn that I start to want to move away from, because wow, we're feeling this pretty good, everything's great, but now you start bringing in Willie, but Willie also has a friend,
Mhm.
and I don't even know, why would you bring a skeleton home with you?
I don't know. He seems like something of a trickster. So he brings the skeleton home, and it seems to me that his whole purpose in bringing the skeleton home was to play tricks on people. So he takes this skeleton down into the basement where the servants are, and he hides it in different places so that they will discover it. And when, of course, they discover it, they scream and go running like I think almost anyone would, and he just gets the biggest kick out of this. So he's quite busily enjoying himself um, in the basement of the mansion, and probably maybe in the servant quarters as well. But it is very interesting that he brings a skeleton home with him, and I read that it was a what did they call it? An articulated skeleton. So I don't really know what that means. I should have looked it up. I don't know if it was a real human skeleton or if it was a plastic skeleton. I'll tell you, Chris, at the college, we both teach at this college. In the biology lab, they have an actual human skeleton. Now, they've got a lot of skeletons and stuff around the classroom. All of them are plastic or whatever those skeletons are made of. There is one that is real. I mean, it's a cadaver, but it's just the skeleton that is an actual human skeleton. And I'll tell you, Chris, when you go in there and you look at that, and I've been in there, I've looked at it, and it's a different feeling than looking at one of the plastic ones, because at one point at some time in the past that skeleton was part of a real human being.
And at this point, many listeners are wanting to turn off the podcast.
But the good thing, Chris, is I'm not roll it's on a like a rack thing. That sounds terrible, but it's well, you get the picture. It's got wheels, not on the skeleton, but it's on a device that has wheels. I'm not running down the hall with this thing going to take it to scare people with it. So Willie and I are not even in the same category.
No, but at this time of the year, you do find people who like to scare people, and I'll just go back. I think one of the interesting things about this whole Bellamy Mansion and is the fact that you have General Hawley and Dr. Bellamy working out a deal to reclaim the land or the house, right? And then the other thing that comes about this is that um, Mrs. Bellamy, she actually goes and meets with General Hawley's wife. to get her house back also. So you've got the men trying to do it, and General Hawley says, sure, Dr. Bellamy, if you swear an oath of allegiance, you can have it. Well, Miss Bellamy, she goes to meet Miss Hawley's trying to get her thing, and basically Miss Bellamy is upset because there's a quote Yankee running her home, and that was that term that she did not use because we are in the midst of the Civil War, and this is difficult. And it says that Miss Bellamy was a gentle Southern lady,
Mm-hmm.
that she was very kind, she was very polite, she always behaved proper with great politeness. But when she walked into the house and she saw what Nurse Hawley had done,
Yeah.
to the point where she saw the basement that looked like a hog pen now. And what really ticked her off, and I just thought this was an interesting part of the history, is what really ticked her off is that while Harriet Hawley, the one from the north, was talking to Miss Bellamy, the gentle Southern lady, that Miss Hawley kept spitting tobacco into the fireplace. So, and you just have to imagine you've got a gentle Southern lady and you've got just a good old woman from the north who does it her way. And that, well, she is so upset because the walls, the paint, the floors, it's all filthy dirty, and so she is so upset. And then you've got the nerve to spit into a fireplace while I'm talking to you. Well, Ray, you know what? Oh, Willie might have been doing some things down there in the basement, but I can tell you, seeing Miss Hawley spit some tobacco into the fireplace is probably what set her off, and she probably haunts those houses today looking for anybody that is going to spit in her fireplace.
I will be honest with you. Um, if I was in a room with Miss Hawley and she proceeded to spit into the fireplace, that would probably disturb me too. And I think, and I'm trying to remember who it was. I think I had, oh gosh, a great aunt or somebody who did, what do they call it? Snuff? Is that what they call it?
Enough for tobacco. Remember, they all had the pouch tobacco, is what I
Yeah.
remember.
And she had like a jar or something, and she would spit in that jar. And I thought that's just something. That's something.
My granddaddy would do that same thing, and he'd just have that little spit jar, and
Mhm.
he'd pull that wad of tobacco out of the little
Mhm.
pouch, and he'd stick it in his mouth. And I'm so thankful that I didn't do it. Well, I don't know if Miss Harriet was that, but I do know that she also ticked off Miss Bellamy because um, she offered her some figs, and she said, "These are some of my figs I'd like to offer." And Miss Bellamy said, "I'll have you know, those are figs that I grew in that tree when this was my house. So don't you offer me no figs." That you say. I mean, so you can imagine you've got a Southern lady and a Northern lady getting together.
I
It
want
might
to
have been all out war.
I want to get into a time machine, go back to this conversation and be a fly on the wall just to watch it and hear it. This is going to be a this would be very interesting. I mean, it sounds like the Bellamy family sounds like a very interesting family. You got Dr. Bellamy, he's this ardent cessationist. You've not cessationist, he's this ardent um Confederate person. He's all for secession. There's the word I'm looking for. He is married to this Southern woman who clearly, she's her own person. They've got this son, Willie, who's brought a cadaver skeleton home from college. He's playing tricks on the staff there in the house. You've just got to, that just has to be an interesting family. One person I do want to mention, though, is their daughter, Ellen. Did you do any research on Ellen? Ellen just absolutely fascinated me. So she's their last surviving child of the Bellamys. She's the last one. She's the one that makes it to the end. She dies in 1946, and she is 94 years old, or 94 years young. And she doesn't leave the house or the mansion for about a dozen or more years. There at the end of her life, she's not so much a recluse as that she's sort of bed bound and wheelchair bound. So she's not able to get out and go. So she doesn't really go anywhere. To this day, Chris, there are people who claim they've got her wheelchair there in the mansion. There are people who claim that that wheelchair will move on its own, or that they have been followed around the mansion, at least to some degree or another, by that wheelchair. Some people think Miss Ellen is still roaming the halls of Bellamy Mansion.
Yeah, and I, I mean, there's rumors that you can find if you look in the window. It's a really beautiful
Hmm.
some windows at the top of the house, and there's rumors today that you can see an elderly couple kind of looking out of the window, and I know that there's been some talk of some of the enslaved. I
Hmm.
remember that's one of the things that I remember when I was touring the place, that there were some in apparitions or ghosts or whatever you call it of some of the slaves that are outside in some of the
Hmm.
enslaved quarters. And so I remember hearing that while I was there, and it was during the day. But I still remember kind of squishing myself very close and wondering, okay, how much longer before I can get out of here? Because just the thought of knowing that there was some ghost that was nearby me, well, it does something to me.
Well, I'll tell you, Chris, every time I've actually been to this location, it's been at night in the dark. Um, we used
Doesn't surprise me.
no, it doesn't. So it is something because they talk about seeing the older man and woman, the apparition. They talk about noises and other appearances and things like that. Maybe a light coming on in the building when nobody's in there. And there's no detectors or anything to turn the light on. So it is interesting because you're standing out there and you're sort of, at least if you're me, you're standing out there and you're sort of waiting for something to happen. I've never experienced anything there. Like I said, I've never been into it, but a friend of mine a number of years ago actually was at an event there at the Bellamy Mansion, and he went, I believe it was upstairs to use the restroom there at the mansion. And he said while he was in the restroom, he said something banged on the door, bang, 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 bang. And he said, his initial thought was, well, that's just rude. Somebody's in here. I'll be done in a second. He opens the door with probably a little defensiveness, and there is nobody there. And he looks around, and there's nobody there. And that actually fits stories I've heard. People who've done ghost hunting there. I don't think they allow just anybody in there, but people who've done some ghost hunting there, again, the idea of banging on doors, something like slamming into doors and banging on it really loudly. Um, Now, I don't mind to tell you, Chris, even though I like the idea of the spooky, I would have left the dinner party right then, right there, no questions asked. But he's told me this story multiple times about being there in Bellamy Mansion and having that experience there. So even though he is what I would call a skeptic, when it comes to things like ghosts and spooks and things. But that one, is something he'll tell that story if you ask him about it.
Golly day. You know, I appreciate people who are able to experience haunted things and things of that nature, but me just hearing about it gives me the willy jillies.
Was you'll have nightmares tonight.
Well, well, thanks. I appreciate that.
It's an interesting building. It is certainly one of the nicest historical sites in Wilmington. And look, folks, if you're ever in southeastern North Carolina and you can get to Wilmington, Wilmington is just a very unique place. Especially, historic downtown Wilmington, whether you're talking about Front Street, Bellamy Mansions on Market Street, there is so much there. Oakdale Cemetery, there's all sorts of of historical buildings and historical sites and history to learn about in Wilmington. If you're interested in the haunted aspect of Wilmington, of course, during the Halloween season, there are numerous people doing ghost tours and stuff. It's a very nice town, even though I don't know that it has maybe the reputation of a Charleston or something like that. It definitely in ways has that feel, especially this time of the year when you're talking about the historical sites, the history, and even the hauntings.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the great things about what we do, especially during the month of October, where we introduce people into some of the unique history you didn't know but should, but also put a little slant to it because history can be spooky.
Mhm.
It can be scary, but we take those events and we've kind of turned them around so that they become stories that remind us of the people who once lived and the stories that they tell. And I guess, right, if you think about some of the Bellamy family, the stories that they're still telling even today.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. But one thing I always remind myself is it's not the dead you have to worry about, it's the living. If you're walking down the street in any city, it's not the dead you got to worry about. It's the living you got to worry about. All right, Chris. Well, thanks for another great episode. To our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Always feel free to reach out to us on Facebook. We do have a Facebook website, History You Didn't Know But Should. Please like this episode on Spotify or wherever you're listening to it and share it with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.